Friday, September 29th, and it is raining. This is episode 3.
All right, this is Dr. Stout. Picking up where we left off last week, we were talking about the growth of the brain, how that related to change in diet from mostly carbohydrate-based, high-fiber roots to a more meat-rich diet. Still a lot of digging for roots, but now it's changing to sort of softer and higher calorie content meat, and that this was enabling a huge expansion of brain growth. And so there was the co-evolution of our tools and our brains. So we got tools that could get through hides and get into bone marrow and supply the fat that our developing brains would have needed as infants and toddlers as they're expanding really rapidly. So in evolution, there are often major changes, and then things sort of coast along for a while, and then there's more major changes. In human evolution, interestingly, the brain continued to get larger over a long period of time. So there was probably a continuous improvement in the diet. So we would have gone from being confrontational scavengers running out to a piece of meat and scaring the hyenas away, to actual hunters. And so our pre-adaptations for being bipeds, for being able to run long distances, would have allowed us to do things like confrontational scavenging. Not confrontational scavenging, persistence hunting. So we would have been able to just run at an animal until it collapsed from exhaustion. So we are... much like we have extra large brains, which is what we notice all the time, we are also unusually efficient at long distance movement in a way that at noon in the middle of the day, if we chase a large gazelle, we can run it to death. And we would actually target the mature males because they're heavier, it's harder for them to run. And we do it right in the middle of the day when it's hottest for them because we're the only things that sweat.
How long did this transition take from?
So this is probably the next 1.5 million years. Things are going almost logarithmically faster. So it's 4 million years, then it's 2 million years, and the next thing we're going to be looking at is 200,000 years. So it was, first it's doubling, and then it's powers of 10. Things are going much, much faster. So the brain's getting bigger. We're having more capabilities, and then we discover fire. And so fire becomes one of our other tools that we co-evolve with. And between that and the stone tools, our ability to digest food starts to improve. We're able to get food digested essentially outside of our bodies. We mash it up, we cook it. Up until fire, everything had been raw. And so now what fire does for you is it breaks apart the food, makes it much easier to absorb.
Even the meat had been raw.
Even the meat had been raw, and we might have cut it and pounded it a little bit to soften it up. But, we have that saying, sit around and chew the fat. Everything was really, really tough. And certainly anything you pulled off of a dried carcass on the Serengeti that the hyenas hadn't taken yet was going to be kind of dry and tough. And so we were really good at chewing. We had the extra thick teeth. But now, interestingly, our teeth start to get smaller again. And so we don't have the same teeth as the Australopithecines have, but they're still thicker than and larger than a chimp would have. Also flatter for grinding. So our diets have changed, but it's still really tough. And we have a lot of exercise in our mouth. Our jaws are thick and strong, and our facial muscles are designed for being able to bite through a bone or to rip meat off using our teeth from something that's already partially dried. But with fire, we're able to soften everything and start cooking. And so it probably was first roasting, maybe some boiling later, putting a tuber under a fire to let it soften. And this is also detoxifying a lot of plants. A lot of plants have anti-nutritional factors that will actually, if you were eating nothing but soybeans raw, you would starve to death. They would actually block their own absorption of food. They have things that destroy proteins and prevent themselves from getting eaten. So raw foods were certainly our history, but it's not what we ended up evolving for. We evolved to eat partially digested foods, stuff that had pounded with our tools and that had been softened and cooked. So our brains are getting larger, and it's at the same time as our stomach is getting smaller. And so we're able to digest the food as efficiently.
Why is our stomach getting smaller?
Our stomach is getting smaller because we're able to give it pre-processed food. It doesn't have to do as much work. And so we don't end up needing any more calories just to sit and exist than we did before, even though our brain is now taking almost a fifth of our total calories. We have turned our brain into this freakish organ that is absorbing all of our energy. And what we've done is we've reduced our stomach size. And so the overall cost of existence has switched from being associated with digestion to being associated with supplying the brain with glucose and oxygen. So that's our main metabolic cost. So our brains have been growing. Our tools have been improving, and you're seeing a continuous improvement in what would be the language areas. So the left-hand sides of the brain, the lowering of the larynx, so that we're able to form words more clearly. But our tools have remained roughly the same for the last 2 million years. They're basically hand axes. They're hand axes and choppers and varieties of those things.
Hand axes meaning just carved pieces of stone.
A large stone about the size of a cell phone that's sharp all the way around, and that I speculate was used for throwing mostly against members of our own species. They were our anti-personnel weapons.
So it's not something on a stick like an axe.
Not something on a stick. And then starting around 300,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, depending where and when, we start to develop spears. And so there's another transition. This is the transition to the Middle Stone Age. This is when Neanderthals are developing, when Denisovans are developing, and it's when we're starting to see the first evidence of spears in Africa. So
but we just jumped a bunch of time.
Yeah, so we went from 2 million years ago, we suddenly get brains. Maybe 1 million years ago, we're getting fire. And then around 300,000 years ago, we're starting to get spears. And this is another big change. So now we have the ability to keep someone far away from us with our spear. And this is probably also related to changes in stature. So male Australopithecines are twice the size of females. Homo erectus is 15-20% larger than the female. So we're getting closer to the modern differences. And assuming that we didn't stop competing for females, why would the males have become more equal in size to the females? We didn't, I don't think, switch to a monogamous relationship where there's no male-male competition. I think what happened is we've switched the competition to something done with spears. And so like what we'd seen in the transition to hand axes, we're using our tools as a way of fighting each other and display. So you wave the spear in the air and someone backs up. But again, you can have war. Bunch of guys with spears are so much more effective than a bunch of people with just hand axes. So this is a technology that spreads pretty rapidly, and you see it reinvented in several different places. So it's happening in Europe with the Neanderthals, it's happening in Asia with Denisovans.
So it's both being passed along and also being invented spontaneously,
right.
All at the same time.
As our brains get bigger, we figure out that a sharp stone on a stick is a huge reach advantage.
So can I ask you, you discussed why, and how our jaws became what they are in our facial structure. Why did we start devoting so much of a large quantity of our calories to our brains? Why did the brains develop the way that they did? Was it?
Well, a large brain was the new adaptation. It's like a bird's wing. So we have a large brain because it allows us to get more resources, but we need those resources to feed the large brain.
So thinking was more important now in getting food.
Absolutely. It was the only way we could make the tools that we were making. We had to pass these ideas along to each other. We had to have concepts. We had to have some way of explaining things.
So a better brain actually led to greater survival possibilities.
And now most predators tend to be smarter than most prey animals. Just sort of as a general rule, a killer whale is going to be smarter than a blue whale, and a coyote is going to be smarter than a deer. But we pushed that to a much higher level where we were becoming social predators that required social interactions, and our hunting became our main way of getting calories. A hunter-gatherer on her own could support her offspring maybe barely, right? So you need about 1,500 calories a day. That's about what you can gather in a day if you're working hard. Particularly with a toddler in tow, it might be only about 1,000. So you would slowly starve to death if you were trying to gather your own food. So you need someone who can bring meat. Now that might be the male and the female working together to get meat. It could be just the male on their own. Up until recently, we tended to think of it as just the male on their own, but it turns out that females working as part of the group pushing animals towards the hunters would have been a typical way that a whole tribe together would have been gathering resources. So again, it's social interaction combined with hunting ability, combined with language, combined with tools. So all the advantages we've already seen with brains are now coming together with fire and our stones to give us new advantages for getting calories, which allows us to get bigger brains. So this is a continuous push towards larger and larger brains. It's something that was going on with very heavy selection. Whoever was smartest had more babies, and so that was the definition of Darwinian fitness. And then somewhere around 150, maybe 200,000 years ago, well into the middle Paleolithic, after we'd had spears already, things started to change again. And we don't know exactly what was happening. For a while, there was this sort of wonderful theory that there was a point mutation in the language gene, and that this had given us the ability to have abstract thought. But now it's looking like there was probably several mutations over a longer period of time, which probably is more real if you think about how things happen. It's usually not a bolt from the blue that makes everything happen all at once.
What caused these several mutations over time?
Well, what causes mutations is random chance. Cosmic rays hit your DNA and something changes. Most of the time it's bad, but these were what are known as missense mutations. So it didn't change it to something that didn't work. It changed it to a different kind of amino acid. So from one amino acid to another, and now you've got an enzyme that's doing something else entirely. So the FOXP2 region of the genome is a collection of regulatory genes. It's not just a sort of single speech gene that gives you imagination, but it's rather a region that controls brain development in general. And so any mutations in these brain development regions of the genome tend to be really bad. And that's how we found the FOXP2 gene. There was some mutations in it and people couldn't speak correctly, but their non-speech intelligence hadn't gone down. It was just regarding speech. So we realized that there is an actual separation between speech and intelligence in terms of what you can measure. So that was why people started looking into this region and found out that there were unique adaptations that made us different from the chimpanzees in the FOXP2 region, and that they were highly selected for. If they changed in any way, you did not pass on those genes. Some of the original studies, the problem was they'd only looked at Europeans, and it turns out that Europeans had gone through a population bottleneck, so it looked like that these genes had been selected for much more recently rather than reality, which is that they were older genes. Now, it does appear as there is another portion of FOXP2, not the ones that were originally found, that seems to have some overall regulatory function, which is also seeming to be relatively recent, but the authors were not going to speculate about exactly where or when it had happened, like the people had with the earlier gene. They decided not to go that far. But it seems as though there was a continuous series of mutations in the language region of our genome, and that some of these were happening probably during the Middle Paleolithic. Some of the genes you find in Neanderthals, which were outside of Africa, as well as the African populations, so it means it had to have been before the split. But then, when we actually left Africa, when we interbred with Neanderthals, we did not take their language genes. All of the language genes that modern humans have stayed from the genes that we developed in Africa. We did not cross out any of those genes. So we have several skin, hair, immune system genes that come from Neanderthals and populations that are not from sub-Sahara. So the people left Africa, they crossbred with Neanderthals, got a whole set of new genes, but not the language gene. So whatever it is that we have, Neanderthals didn't have. It's a highly conserved region, did not crossbreed with the Neanderthals. Anytime it did, those people got selected out. we maintained our language gene intact with no modifications. So that's an important indication that it's vital to who we are. And so what do you see happening culturally that coincides with this change in the FOXP2 region? You start to see things that indicate a higher level of conception, abstract thought. So this is when we get the first art. So art starts about 80,000 years ago, and it's very simple. It looks like a hashtag made of some scratches on a piece of red stone. But we think that we were probably painting each other at this time. And the technology that you start to see...
Painting each other, you mean painting on each other's bodies.
So we find these palettes with red ochre, which is a great paint, but we don't find it painted on the walls yet. So we were purposely collecting paint and then putting it into a little shell to hold the paint. And we were scratching patterns in the stone you got the paint from, but there's no paint on the walls yet. So we assume that we were painting each other, or maybe stone artifacts, or maybe wooden things, but something that was not the cave walls yet. So we don't have evidence of that. But the art is there, and with the art, you see advanced technologies like fishhooks and needles. And both of these...
All of this happens at the same time.
All of this happens at the same time. So this is, again, sort of the coevolution of our technology and our imagination and our diet. So
this development in imagination and essentially theoretical thought that's transformed into things that exist, this didn't happen. This isn't one thing.
It wasn't one thing. It was a progression. But once it had all come together, then it stayed the same. Then it was heavily selected for. Whatever series of genes we got were really important. So, for example, there seems to be a protein that is not expressed in humans that is expressed in chimpanzees that was selected for at this particular time. That seems to be really important. It's a regulatory gene. We don't know exactly what it does, and it's next to FOXP2, and so it seems to be involved with all of FOXP2. So it's the way the genes get expressed. And
we know it's involved, but we just don't know.
Not yet. There's too many things, because regulatory genes can have other regulatory genes that regulate them. And then they regulate other things, which might be genes that regulate other things.
Everyone answers to someone.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a whole bunch of feedback loops, and there was a bunch of mutations, and then they stayed fixed essentially. And there is some variation, but they tend to be in regions that are not the key regulatory sites. So anyway, we're developing things like fishhooks, and if you think about what a fishhook can do and what it involves, this is where you really get the grasp of the development imagination. You have to imagine a fish in the water that you can't see. You have to imagine what that fish is going to eat.
What it wants.
What it wants, exactly. Where it lives, what it wants. Because the fish aren't everywhere. They're in a particular spot. They're living next to that rock over there. And you have to find them without seeing them, and then somehow get it to bite at your fishhook. So you have to find the food it wants to eat. You then have to make some sort of line to connect that fishhook to some sort of pole or way to get that fishhook out there. All of these things is a multi-step process before you have a fish, right? If you want to get into a carcass, all you need is a sharp rock. You can see the carcass right in front of you. You know you need to cut it. You've got a rock in your hand. You just break that rock, you cut the carcass. Everything is very direct. But now things are much more abstract. They're stepping back to another level. Same thing with a needle.
And that took 200,000 years.
Well, no, that took 1.5 million years to get from where we were to where we are now.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're around between 500,000 and 200,000 years. This is all happening, and by 200,000 years, it's happened.
It's done.
It's done. Yeah, and so it took about 300,000 years for it all to settle, but it took 1.5 million years to get there. But we suddenly see these new technologies. It didn't happen that we got a bad fish hook and then a better fish hook, because none of it works until you can imagine the fish, and none of it works until you're making thread. And thread is useful, right? Ropes are always useful, but a really small rope isn't useful unless you're thinking of tying something up. You have to think of another thing involved. Nothing is direct with a thread. And so it's the same with the needles. You have to prepare a hide in some way. You have to make a thread to sew the hide. You have to imagine, I'd really like to not freeze when it gets cold, and so I have to make this ahead of time. And it has to go through several steps. You can't just take the hide off of something and wear it directly. You have to soften it, mostly through chewing, but also through possibly boiling it in something. So these new technologies are all coming together: the control of fire, the control of making fine tools that work with other tools. And these are all happening more or less at the same time. And this sets the stage for us to leave Africa. With these new technologies, we're able to leave. Now, our ancestors 1.5 million years ago had already left Africa. So the first set of technologies, the hand axe, probably enabled us to travel. Certainly, the having stone tools at all enabled us to follow the herds out of Africa, to follow the grassland animals. And so we were a grassland predator following grassland animals. And so the elephants walked out of Africa and we followed them. That was 1.5 million years ago. We probably tried a couple of times after that, but there were already people there then. So it was much more difficult to leave Africa. We may have left in 2 separate waves. The first wave was about 100,000 years ago. Doesn't seem to have survived. We don't have any genes from that. What we did find was we find human mitochondria in Neanderthals from about 100,000 years ago. We don't find it from before that, but we find it after that. And we find art in Neanderthals starting around then. So I suspect that there was a wave out of Africa around 100,000 years ago, didn't survive, crossbred with Neanderthals. They got our mitochondria and our speech genes, and it enabled them to start making some primitive art, handprints on the wall, nothing like a picture of a woolly mammoth or something like that, but lines on walls, handprints, that sort of thing. And then 60,000 years ago, another wave of humans leaves Africa, and we're able to survive. And we wipe out the Neanderthals within about 20,000 years. We wipe them out fairly quickly. So we are not necessarily nice. While we are very much social animals, we are social hunters. We can't get along without each other. Our babies will starve without help. Our societies will collapse if we don't work together. We're also genocidal murderers. We wander into a new area and we eat everything we can if we can catch it. And so this is sort of the pattern of our history after this. Every time we enter a new area, whoever has the best technology wins. Whoever has the worst technology disappears.
Just dies.
And it's usually their Y chromosome that disappears. It's usually the male chromosome, so it seems as though we're killing all the males and keeping the females. So the same thing that Columbus did when he got to the Taino in Hispaniola. All of the Y chromosomes were gone within a couple generations. The Taino had done to the same islands in Hispaniola 400 years previously. When they'd gotten there, there'd been people there already, and all of the Y chromosomes disappeared. So this is absolutely something that is part of our history.
It's something we do.
It is something we do, but we also interbreed with the people there, and so the genes are not lost entirely. So even though we wiped out the Neanderthals, we have Neanderthal genes. It's only about 2% of our total genome, but we share that. So in terms of sort of diet and exercise, what would have been happening at this time? Again, transition to meat, but now we have a wider variety of foods. So we're able to eat marine sources of food. So we're able to go fishing. We have harpoons, right? That's another thing that involves knowing where something is. You have to have a harpoon point with barbs tied onto a stick with a line that then stops the thing not swimming away. You have to be able to understand how to aim a harpoon. You know, the diffraction means that the target you're looking at is 10 degrees over from where you actually have to aim. So our ability to get new sources and a greater variety of sources of food has greatly expanded. We're probably making snares, right? So a string can get you a rabbit. You chase the rabbit into the little noose, and suddenly you have a smaller animal fairly easily. So this is a wide variety of foods. It's probably how we outcompeted the Neanderthals. It wasn't just all, going up and killing them directly, slaughter, but it was just eating all the foods that they would normally eat. And so you see us pushing out the Neanderthals, and with this comes a whole new level of art. And again, probably due to various pro-European biases. At first, we thought this was only happening in Europe, but we're now finding out this is happening everywhere. We head to Indonesia, and we start painting on the walls in Indonesia 40,000 years ago. We're painting the animals we hunt. We're seeing the same thing in Malaysia. We start seeing this in Europe. We're seeing woolly mammoths on the walls. We're seeing the rhinos.
And why is this happening all around the world at the same time?
Because we've left Africa with these superior language genes that allows us imagination. And with imagination, with these new technologies that imagination can give us, with the new social interactions that we have, we also have the desire to paint what we see.
So these progressions are innate in us and developing all at the same time, everywhere.
Everywhere, yeah. It's not confined to any single population. Certainly in the earlier, more racist version of human evolution, there were a lot of suppositions that there was something special about European populations or something not special about sub-Saharan African populations, but that is not the case. These are all genes that evolved in Africa. We brought out of Africa.
This was being human happening.
Being human happening, and it came from an African population. Interestingly, Europeans probably had dark skin till about 4,000, 5,000 years ago, and it was a Middle Eastern farming population that displaced the hunter-gatherers. The supposed Ubermenches of early Europe would have had dark skin and been the tall hunters that the Nazis really loved. They were not what the Nazis would have wanted them to look like. Those were Middle Eastern farmers who came in and displaced them, possibly with a Neanderthal gene, making them unusually pale. Because Europeans are indeed paler than other groups, but it is literally only skin deep. It's just melanin, and it didn't even come from Europe. So it's interesting to think of how our sort of spiritual life is directly related to our development of technology and is directly related to the things we eat and how we live. The ability to keep ourselves warm in a cave means that we're able to survive the Ice Age winters, which means that we have a community sitting in the cave and painting on the walls, which means we start to think about the flickering lights and the things we see in our brains. And we start putting our imagination onto the walls of the cave. And this is the beginning of some sort of spiritual development, and is accompanying a whole new set of things that we can eat. So our teeth have continued to get smaller as our diet has gotten higher quality. Our brain has continued to get larger, and this is the largest our brain gets. So in the middle of the Ice Age, our brain is up to 1350 cc's, same size as a Neanderthal, but a very different shape. We have a much rounder brain. The left side of our brain, our language brain, is much larger. And it's 1,000 cc's larger than a chimpanzee. So a chimpanzee's brain is 350 cubic centimeters, and a Ice Age hunter-gatherer's brain was 1,350 cubic centimeters. So much, much larger. Modern human brains are closer to 1,150. We've shrunk again since then. So this was the apex of our, just in terms of brain size. Now, we don't, again, have any of the actual brains left over, so we don't know what they would have looked like. We know folding in a brain is extremely important for the way regions communicate with each other and for the ability to process information. So a chimp's brain is not just smaller, it's also much less folded. So there's something about the development of the forebrain in humans, the development of language regions that includes very, very deep folds in the brain. And so this could have continued to happen, but probably was fully developed by 50,000 years ago, let's say. So this is showing that we can't just think about how we live in terms of what foods we should eat outside of our entire mental life. Everything we're doing is based on our ability to imagine things. So we were imagining what we were hunting. We were then painting it on the wall, so we were able to display our imagination. We were able to get into the minds of our actual the things we were actually eating. And it's something to think about in the modern world, how we've separated ourselves from our diet, so that we no longer imagine the animals that we're interacting with in any way. We are now essentially separated from them. We've also confined our diet in many ways. We eat only a few kinds of meat. We eat very few plants at all, right? We only have a few staple plants that we eat. We have a few sort of condiment plants on the side, like your side dishes. But we've now confined our diet to only a few different kinds of foods, and this is going to have profound effects on our health. By having particularly high fiber diets with a variety of different sources, you're building structural diversity in your stomach as you eat. And this is going to provide different kinds of structural diversity for bacteria. So when you're building your microbiome, the flora that live with you, you are actually limiting it by the numbers of kinds of foods you eat, particularly the high calorie, high carbohydrate, easily digestible staple foods, the starches. And I think that's really been our downfall since the development of farming. That's probably why our brains got smaller, was the development of farming, periodic starvation due to drought, etc. Only the small farmers survived. Farming communities tend in general to be smaller than ones with more meat in their diet. And all of these things are then accompanied by a whole range of problems for health. So we went from being people who would run for a mile and then take a couple days off and then walk for a couple of miles and then dig something and then chop something, to someone who had to work really hard all day. And so farming is bad for your back and it's bad for your joints, but at least you're getting decent exercise. You're strong. You're still moving. So these are the kinds of transitions that are happening, where we go from what we were evolved for, which was definitely hunter-gatherer, to something that we were not evolved for, which is living in one place in large groups, passing diseases to each other, and digging all day. We went from being runners and walkers to being diggers, essentially. And that was a major change, and our species got smaller. Our brains got smaller. We became shorter. We generally, even though our populations went way up, we became much more numerous. We were not as healthy. And so when you want to think about health, you want to sort of think about this beginning period, the hunter-gatherer period, where we're developing early forms of a spiritual life, as also the time when we're developing probably our optimal diet, our optimal exercise routines. But it was not simply eating one kind of meat all the time. It was eating many different meats, eating much more of the entire animal. It would have been wide sources of carbohydrates, probably a lot of fasting, right? You would go for a couple of days without food before you'd find the food. When you get the meat, you'd eat nothing but meat for a whole day, because you can't preserve the meat very easily. And then you would be eating, whatever roots or berries or whatever it is you can gather most of the time. So most days people are gathering maybe 1,000 calories a day of purely carbohydrates, very high fiber. And then every once in a while, there's a huge influx of high calorie meat that keeps everyone alive. So it wasn't a life of just living on, just muscle meat. It would have been a wide variety of foods with mostly carbohydrates most of the time, but then just binging on meat periodically, and also periodic fasting. So if you think about many of the modern sort of diet approaches, they all work for different ways. So something like the Mediterranean diet works because it's really focusing on the complex carbohydrates and variety. Some of the what they call paleo diets might work because they're cutting out the sugars and they're cutting out those simple starches, so they lower the glycemic response and the insulin response. These diets work for different reasons, but they work because they're approximating what we were evolved for. We were evolved for eating almost only vegetables most of the time, and then having tremendous amounts of meat periodically. We were also evolved for large amounts of varied exercise, not just one thing, not digging all day, but lots of variety of exercise. And we were evolved to have a spiritual life, to be part of a community, to work together, to imagine things and then put them onto the wall, to see our inner life expressed in our community with each other, and to see how our imagination develops. All right.
Wow, that was fascinating. Where are we going next time?
I'm not sure. I think we will start talking about specific aspects of the diet. So I'd like to talk about the role of sugar. I would like to talk about the role of intermittent fasting. I would like to talk about things like various kinds of exercise that are not just one kind. I want to talk about the details of health that we've talked about. And then I'd like to talk about the role of the imagination in our lives. So I'd like to break down some of the themes I've been working on and focus on those.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much. See you next time.